There is a storm brewing. Storm EW. Changing everything you know about electromagnetic warfare. Keeping you ahead of next-generation threats. And scaling to meet the mission. The coverage needed to advance into the battle space. Update your fleet right now. Bring the storm.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To hear the simultaneous interpreting, please select an audio channel by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. This program is organized by ISIC Japan in association with James and produced by Bloom Pacific and Verstech. Supporters in alphabetical order are BAE Systems, LC Harris Technologies, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies. Interpreters are Paul Hersey and Yoko Mitchell. I would now like to turn the floor over to former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Abe's cabinet, Dr. Taniguchi Tomohiko, to moderate this Defense Industry Forum on the topic of industrial policy for national security, pathways to efficiencies, resilience, and innovation.
今日も ISIC のセミナーをやりたいと思います。日本では今から
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're having yet another ISIC webinar today. President Zelensky of Ukraine just made a speech to the Diet via video. Due to Russia's invasion, Ukraine is resisting with great persistence, but it's thanks to very cheap drones, volunteers, cyber forces staffed by volunteers. This is a war, I think we can say, that is having a lot of implications for the defense industry. This will be an epoch-making year for Japan. By the end of the year, a new defense strategy will be revised and announced. That's why the budget for defense, we hope, will grow because of this. Prime Minister Kishida has made suggestions along those lines. We have three wonderful panelists for today's ISIC webinar to address a very hot topic. As usual, we are able to conduct our webinar without worrying about the wall between the two languages. We have two interpreters with us, Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Hersey, to help us with this. And we have sponsors that are making this all possible. Our heartfelt thanks go to them. One housekeeping point. Comments and questions are very much welcome, but please use the Q&A function. There are some participants that send in a lot of questions. Please understand that we will not be able to answer all of your questions. At the end of today's program, one of our directors, Mr. Nabeta, will be making a request for our participants in Japan. We hope you will stay until the end. So now we are ready to introduce our participants. Koichi Isobe was Commanding General of the Eastern Army of the Ground Self-Defense Forces. He's had a very unique career. He went to the Defense University in the US and went to the Command and Staff General College and got master's degree at both, has a wealth of experience. General Isobe, you have the floor. Thank you, Professor Taniguchi. I am a former Ground Self-Defense Force General Koibi Isobe. During my career, I participated in the revisions of the National Defense Program Guidelines, which is a strategy document. And today, I'll talk about the National Defense Program Guidelines and the National Security Strategy Study Group. My thanks to ISIC for having me on this webinar. Please move to my first slide. So it says NSS study group here. In 2013, the current national security strategy was created, and it is to be revised roughly 10 years on. So this is the year prior to when it's to be revised. Next page, please. The national security strategy had a study group set up, chaired by a former chairman of the former chief of staff of the Joint Staff, General Oriki, and the vice chair was former administrative vice minister of defense Kuroi, and then two former general officers of each of the services. Next slide, please. Now, this NSS study group had as objective to review the 2013 NSS and to make recommendations for the next national security strategy. We began meeting in February of last year, held 20 meetings for a total of roughly 40 hours. And we completed our work in November of last year. And based on that, we sent a report to the government and commented on our report to the media. Next slide, please. This is what came out in the media. This is the English language version of the Yomiuri Shimbun, which is one of the major dailies. Next page. Now, this is the Nikkei Shimbun in a Japanese language article. Former chief of staff of the Joint Staff is featured in this article. Next slide, please. The basic stance of the study group was that the NSS for the nation, that it ought to be the highest document for strategy. And Japan needs to keenly grasp the trend of changes in the global security environment, make decisions properly, and bring together all of the country's power in order to strengthen our security. So from that perspective, we began by suggesting that there be discussion without taboo, and to also focus on improving effectiveness in making our recommendations, and also to aim for recommendations that would be realistic. So what did we mean by realistic? We didn't want to recommend anything that would be too far removed from the current defense realities. We didn't think that would be very helpful. Next slide, please. I'll now be talking about the next 4 items. The current NSS, what is it? That was made in 2013. How has the strategic environment changed since then? What does the 2013 NSS lack? And then what were our policy recommendations? Next slide, please. So what is the current 2013 NSS? It was the first national security strategy that Japan had created since the end of World War II. And one of its characteristics is that it defines Japan's national interests for the first time since World War II. It mainly focuses on defense and diplomacy, but also space, cyber, energy, ODA, and maritime security strategy. And it covers a span of about 10 years. Next slide, please. My next point is changes in the strategic environment. Next slide, please. So, as to changes in the strategic environment, the first is that the line between military and non-military, the line between peace and war, between these concepts is very blurry, which expands the scope of national security. This is what our group thought. The second point was that great power competition is intensifying. The third point is that AI, 5G, quantum, biotechnology, that emerging technologies will possibly become big game changers. The fourth point was that we felt it was necessary to give consideration to climate change. On the first point, in 2010, Crimea was annexed by Russia, and then there were moves by China in the East China Sea. And on February 14th, Russia invaded Ukraine, and this has become even more prominent. Next slide, please. The third point, what does the current NSS lack? Next slide, please. First, economic security, technology security. These are items that are missing. Second, our stance toward China is not clear in the current document. The international community, including Japan, have an issue of concern. This is the language in the 2013 document, but is it sufficient? The third point, basic defense policies were left untouched in 2013. Counterstrike capabilities, exclusively defense-oriented policy, defense budgets, and so forth. We'll touch on this more later. And last, considerations to climate change. Next slide, please. Now, in conclusion, I'll just give the points of policy recommendations. Next slide, please. The first point, the NSS should be positioned as the supreme strategy document for Japan. Second point, current defense policy should be reviewed and revised as necessary. Specifically, our exclusively defense-oriented policy should be reviewed. Our counter-strike capabilities, or the so-called ability to strike enemy bases, is something that we should have, and that our defense spending should be increased to 2% of GDP. It's not realistic to raise it immediately to 2%. But if budget increases on the order of 7 to 8% are made every year, then our defense budget will double rather over a period of 10 years. The third point was to energize a whole of government approach, specifically to strengthen the functions of the cabinet office and to have all of the ministries and agencies working together, and to have a permanent joint headquarters for the Japan Self-Defense Forces. Next slide, please. Our fourth recommendation was to strengthen the Japan-US alliance, specifically for Japan to take more proactive roles in the alliance, and including at the political level, to build a multi-layered alliance structure and to expand the scope of alliance cooperation areas, including to new areas. Fifth recommendation, realign relationships with major countries. First, define China as a potential threat, and to strengthen our relationships with like-minded countries, specifically with the Quad, with AUKUS, and cooperation with ASEAN. The sixth point was to include approaches in new domains. And the seventh point was to strengthen maritime security in the South and East China Seas. Next slide, please. Our eighth recommendation was to increase our intelligence functions. And the ninth was the topic of today's webinar, economic security and defense industries. The 10th recommendation was to be proactive about climate change. And the 11th was to revise the structure of the NSS. I believe we'll discuss this also later. But to have not National Defense Program guidelines, but first the new NSS. And then the Minister of Defense should develop a national defense strategy instead of NDPGs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isobe-san. Our audience has now heard about our new NSS and national defense strategy that Japan would like to create. We'll now move to our second panelist, Mr. Tetsuro Kuroi, who up until very recently was at the top of the Ministry of Defense. He was the Administrative Vice Minister of Defense. Therefore, he has very good perspectives on overall defense policy. However, today we would like for him to focus on the defense industry and defense industrial policy. Thank you very much, Professor Taniguchi. I'm former Administrative Vice Minister of Defense Tetsuro Kuroi. And within the NSS, I'd like to be talking about enhancing and strengthening defense industrial policy in Japan, and try to go into a bit of depth on that subject. Next slide, please. Now, in revising the NSS this time, there were large issues, and as General Isobe mentioned, how do we respond to China? Authoritarian states such as Russia and China. Now, China especially is mobilizing all of not just its military capabilities, but also economic and advanced technology capabilities. It represents the greatest challenge to national security in the future, we believe. In order to respond to this challenge, it's necessary for countries that share values to cooperate with each other externally. And also domestically, it's necessary for us to comprehensively mobilize not just foreign policy and defense policy, but also industrial policy, science policy, technology policy, and so forth. Until a month or two ago, we were talking about expanding the scope of security, and it was one of the biggest points that we believed. But since then, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Because of this, when a nuclear state uses force, we've seen just how difficult it is to deter it. Currently, Western countries, including Japan, are continuing strict economic sanctions, which of course are effective. But when it comes to deterring Russian use of force, are sanctions as effective as military capabilities? This is an open question. Therefore, the significance of military power will only increase in the international community in the future. Thus, in considering our own strategy, we must accelerate the development of our defensive capabilities. Japan will continue to have defense budgets, and they have been very low, at about 1% of GDP. Isobe-san talked about counter-strike capability, which we lack. There are also areas where Japan is behind, such as cyber, space, electromagnetic spectrum. We must accelerate development in these fields. And Japan also has to deal with advanced technology. This can qualitatively improve military power directly, as well as industrial competitiveness. Therefore, we should make efforts to promote and protect technology capability in both civilian and defense sectors. So these are some big points to be considered in order to speedily create defensive capability and in order to improve our advanced technology sector, the government ought to be active in supporting the defense industry. Next slide. Here, I'll be talking about the environment and current status of Japan's defense industry. Now, there are several quotations from ATLA here. Go one slide back, please. This is the one. Next slide, please. Good. A characteristic of our defense industry, first of all, its market size. Japan's defense industry has consistently produced small quantities of a wide variety of products for only the self-defense forces. And it was 2.5 trillion yen for defense-related procurement in 2020, which is less than 1% of Japan's total industrial production. So one characteristic is that it's very small scale. And even if you look at individual companies, the percentage of their sales that are defense-related is very small. If you look at our sponsors like BAE and Lockheed Martin, defense accounts for 97% of BAE sales, 89% of Lockheed Martin's sales. But in Japan, for Mitsubishi Heavy, it's 13%. For Kawasaki Heavy, it's 16%. For IHI, 10%. The percentages are very small. So not only is our total defense industry small, but defense accounts for a very small percentage of individual companies' sales. So how much is the government providing in terms of resources? Defense budget was held down for a long time after the end of the Cold War, although it began to increase in 2013, just after the second Abe administration began. It still remains at around 1% of GDP in 2022, 10 years after the end of the Cold War. So the defense budget, which ranked number 3 in the world in 2000, had fallen to number 9 as of 2020. Also, in recent years, we've seen a lot of high performance items procured from abroad, like the F-35, E-2D, MV-22, and imports and FMS used to account for less than 10% of our equipment costs. But since the early 2010s, they have stayed at around 15 to 25% of our equipment costs. And unit costs have been increasing, and so have sustainment costs. And defense R&D has been stagnating, both in terms of the amounts of money and in terms of the percentage of government-sponsored research. For 2019, Japan spent 129 billion yen. The US spent over 7 trillion yen. South Korea over 400 billion. The UK over 200 billion. In terms of the percentage of government-funded R&D, defense R&D was only 3% in Japan, 11% in the UK, 16% in South Korea, and 46.9% in the US. So defense R&D is very low in Japan. As a result, many companies are withdrawing from the defense sector in Japan, and engineers are lost since stable production lines can't be maintained. Next slide, please. Now, how can we revive our defense industry? First, the government should be involved actively. We have to have the ability to build and maintain our own systems. The government can't just be a buyer of defense equipments, but the defense industry must be considered to be part of our defensive capabilities. And there are 3 stages in order to achieve this. First, in the 3 important policy documents, including the NSS, a strong message should be included between now and the end of the year. That's the first stage. Continuing after that, and based on those documents, the defense budget should be increased, R&D spending should be increased, and spending to reinforce our industrial base should be increased. We've already begun. The 2022 budget and the 2021 supplemental budget that were just passed in the Diet show a 7.8% increase year over year. As Isobe-san said, if this pace is continued over 10 years, that will result in a doubling of our defense budget. The third stage would be legislation in order to support industry and to reform our contracting system. Now, I have 3 pillars here to revive our defense industry. To make our the defense industry more resilient, to create a situation where our defense industry can be more profitable, we have to review our contracting system and the method by which we select companies, and we have to promote business and sectoral consolidation in order to strengthen corporate structures. And we have to provide budgets in a way that will be, in a way, tolerant of failure, that will promote and protect the development of advanced technology. Finally, the government should take the lead in strategic equipment and technology cooperation. Where progress is not being made, the government should take the initiative by collecting information on partner countries and supporting negotiations with partner governments in order to reduce corporate risk. Sorry to have taken so much time. That's all I had. Thank you very much, Kuroi-san. That was a very full and detailed presentation that you gave us. Now, our next speaker is from a firm called Avocent, and he is active in the United States. Doug Berenson. And he'll be talking about how strategy becomes a paper in the US, and he'll talk about the budgeting process as well in the US. This will be very useful for us to refer to as we think about our own system in Japan. Mr. Berenson, you have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Douglas Berenson. I'm a managing director with Avocent. Avocent is a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C., which provides advisory services to government agencies and corporations on matters related to defense, aerospace, and other areas related to global security. If I could see my first slide, please. Thank you. I'll speak to you today about the process used here in the United States to develop strategy and to link that strategy to defense plans, programs, and budgets. I'll also offer a preview of what we can expect from the strategy that the Biden administration plans to unveil in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'll briefly summarize my presentation here. First, the U.S. process for developing strategy and linking it to budgets involves a very complex array of competing organizations. The process begins with the White House, which develops an overall national security strategy. From there, the Department of Defense develops a national defense strategy, which is used to guide more detailed planning of programs and budgets. Both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy are revisited every 4 years. Every year, annually, the U.S. Department of Defense conducts what is called the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process, which develops a 5-year spending plan, including a new budget request that is submitted to the U.S. Congress. Now, this overall strategy planning process here in the U.S. has been the subject of frequent criticism for being too slow, for doing a poor job of aligning strategy with real budget constraints, and for being too focused on military forces rather than on other forms of national power. Next slide, please. There are many different organizations that interact in the development of U.S. national security planning and in resource allocation. Now, this very complex chart highlights some of the major players in that process, but even this chart minimizes how crowded the defense planning process is. At least notionally, the White House is in charge of all planning activity within the executive branch. But in practice, the Department of Defense exercises enormous power over priorities and budget planning. Now, of course, the Defense Department itself is an extremely complex institution. It houses dozens of subordinate groups, including the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Armed Services, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the combatant commands, and many, many others that interact and compete for influence. Of course, here in the United States, the U.S. Congress has the final say on matters related to spending and budgets. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. So even after the executive branch has developed its strategy and budget plans, the Congress can make changes as it sees fit. Next slide, please. The U.S. strategy planning process is intended to link the high-level national security strategy to a more specific national defense strategy. And that, in turn, informs the Defense Department's annual process to allocate resources among defense programs, personnel, operations, and other defense activities. The process starts at the White House every 4 years, where the National Security Council leads the development of an overall statement of U.S. strategy, which spans beyond military aspects to include economic, diplomatic, and other areas. Also, every 4 years, the Department of Defense develops a national defense strategy, which guides all aspects of defense planning, including the size of military forces, equipment modernization priorities, the readiness of U.S. forces, and many other details. The process is under the control of the Secretary of Defense, but it involves many other players, including the armed services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. The Department of Defense also engages in its annual budgeting process, which, as I said, is known as the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System, or PPBE. This process is conducted every year to update the 5-year program for DoD, which is known as the Future Years Defense Plan. The first year of this 5-year plan results in the budget request that is submitted to Congress for approval or changes. Next slide, please. The process within the Defense Department to set budgets is known as the PPBE process. From start to finish, the process takes over a year and involves complex interactions among many different groups within DoD. The process starts with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which issues guidance to the armed services on how they should set priorities. Then the armed services conduct their individual programming and budgeting activities and develop a draft budget plan that spans over a 5-year period. Following that, the Office of the Secretary of Defense reviews the armed services submissions and makes various adjustments according to its sense of priority and budget expectations. And finally, DoD submits this plan to the White House, which uses the first year of the plan as the president's budget request to Congress. Now, a couple of things to bear in mind. There is great tension between the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the armed services over how to use the resources available. The Office of the Secretary of Defense has to make trades and decisions about priority that span across all military capabilities and forces. The individual armed services tend to focus on maximizing their individual perspectives and interests. And finally, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff provides military advice to the Secretary of Defense and the President on joint priorities, those that cross the bounds of individual armed services. Next slide, please. Now, the Biden administration has taken much longer to publish both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy than is normal. I think that events in Ukraine, along with COVID-19 and rising inflation, have forced the White House to take more time on these documents. However, I think we can predict some broad themes that will feature in both of these strategy review documents. The national security strategy will emphasize other sources of security risk to the United States aside from military threats. The White House will talk much more about climate change and pandemic response than the Trump administration did. It will also emphasize threats to U.S. economic security and point to the Biden administration's broader economic policy agenda. The national defense strategy, however, will be highly similar to the defense strategy published by the Trump administration back in 2018. The new national defense strategy will continue to emphasize China as the primary focus for U.S. defense planning. And this means that we can expect continuity in many aspects of the U.S. defense program, including modernization priorities, geographic focus, and others. Next slide, please. I'll end my presentation here by describing 3 of the main criticisms that have been offered by many observers about the U.S. process for national security strategy and planning. First, many critics argue that the U.S. strategic planning process is too focused on military power and the Defense Department. I think the Biden administration will try this year to give greater focus to diplomatic, economic, and other forms of U.S. national influence. Second, the U.S. defense planning process has been criticized for planning far too ambitious a plan for force structure, equipment modernization, and military readiness than the budget can truly support. The Defense Department tends to make very optimistic assumptions about what can be accomplished with the budget that is available. Now, this year, the DoD will probably receive a very big increase in its budget. But this mismatch between strategy and resources will probably continue. And finally, many observers have criticized that the DoD planning process is too slow. These critics argue that it takes far too long to begin a new project once a critical new requirement is identified. For example, it is difficult for the Defense Department to take advantage of new technologies until long after they have taken root in the commercial sector. The US Congress has sponsored a commission to study possible changes to the PPBE process to address this problem. But it will be September of 2023 before we can see that panel's final report. So this concludes my presentation. I appreciate your interest, and I would be happy to answer questions.
ベレンソンさん、大変参考になる。
Mr. Berenson, thank you for a presentation. There's a lot to learn there. Items in it are similar to Japan's process, others are not. So it was very interesting to hear that. We have 182 participants, and they have sent in a lot of questions. As I said at the outset, we, because of time, do not know whether we can answer everyone's questions in the same way. We will make the attempt. So the first question I'd like to pick up is, one Japanese participant has sent in the following question. I think it's for Isobe-san. The NSS is not unrelated to science and technology trends. In the NSS study group that you participated in, were there science and technology experts? It doesn't look as if that were the case, and I wonder why. So Isobe-san, could you answer that question for us, please? Thank you very much. That's a very good question. So we had, it was a volunteer group composed of people from the Minister of Defense and the services. And it took us about 40 hours over many months. And when you're an advisory committee for the government, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And you get people from various fields. No, we were discussing based on our experience, and we are trying to manage public opinion and trying to get out recommendations quickly. And so former MOD and former self-defense members were trying to list the issues. We may have had a better document with participants from with expertise in science and technology, but that may have slowed our process down. Perhaps I can gain your understanding on that point. Thank you. I have another technical question. The three documents, will they be issued at the same time? If not, then how far in time will they be separated? Former Vice Minister Kuroe, could you answer that one, please? Very good. So basically, if you look at examples in the past, the three documents have been issued at the same time. If there was a gap at all, it might be about on the order of 1 week. So the tone of the three documents should be very much harmonized. Kura-san, when is the goal? What date should we be expecting this to come up? I think it's tough to come up with an exact date, but if you look at the past, it's the end of the year. So from around the end of November to mid-December. And then after these three documents are issued, then the government prepares a draft budget. And the government is able to create a draft budget that reflects these policy documents. And Professor, you know that the cabinet meets on Tuesdays and Fridays, so you might have your eye on those dates. Thank you. And so discussions leading toward these documents and negotiations with finance authorities, how will that to be conducted? Likely, if you look at past examples, I think before the upper house election this summer, the parties in power, especially the LDP, will look at the NSS and other documents and see what the parties in power think should be included in these documents. And I was also invited to these, but the government is conducting hearings with participation from experienced persons. And from the summer to the beginning of the autumn, those preparations will slowly begin in the government, including back and forth dealings with finance authorities, with a view to finishing by the end of November, I believe. Thank you. So there's a prime ministerial aspirant, a woman, LDP parliament member named Takai. And in creating the outline and the three documents, can we think that she has quite a lot of influence? Is this a question for me, Professor? No. If it's tough, then you can just say no comment. Representative Takai is the chairman of the Policy Coordination Committee within the LDP, and that is a central organization within the party. And so her influence is very great, we believe. Thank you. One more point for Kuroe-san. When economic security is established, how much technology transfer will be possible to allies and partners, including India? On sensitive technology, will we go on the defensive? would like to expand our perspectives as much as possible. Personally, I would like to see Japanese equipment transferred to India. And I talked with Minister Kono about that very topic. Japan's government would like to increase its technology partners. On the other hand, our various partners have their own situations. If you look at what's happening now in Ukraine, India itself has a lot of Russian-made military equipment. They're in that historical context with that background. So how much, to what level can we share between the two countries back and forth? I think that that would be the subject of a discussion between the two governments. Climate change, the so-called green transformation, how will this be incorporated into defense planning? We have 2 or 3 questions along these lines. I think that any of our 3 panelists might speak to this. Mr. Berenson, green, climate change considerations, how are these, what are the points of emphasis in US strategy at this point?
I think this issue is being addressed in 2 forms. Number 1 is to be more conscious of the consequences of climate change and how it will require military forces to respond and to adapt. So think about the vulnerability of some U.S. military facilities. Norfolk Naval Base, which is the largest U.S. Navy base in the state of Virginia, is subject to flooding in a very bad way even now. And so the strategy and budget process will think about ways to improve the resiliency of U.S. military facilities against flooding, storms, their electrical power systems, and so forth. There is also thought about how climate change will exacerbate global conflict and increase the need, potentially, for U.S. intervention abroad. So will food and water shortages prompt discord and conflict that will increase the level of of operational tempo that U.S. forces have to respond to? And then the second broad way in which the strategy will think about climate change and clean technology is from a technological solution standpoint. So I think the armed services are starting to think about how they should start to incorporate green technology, energy efficiency, and other kinds of technologies into their force structure. I think that they are much closer to the start of the process of determining that than they are to actually having solutions. And in many ways, I think the US military will follow the lead of the commercial sector. So as the commercial aviation sector pioneers the use of alternative fuels and things of that nature, I think the US military will be a follower and not a leader. But they are starting to think about where these kinds of technologies will be required in their own forces.
Thank you very much. Kuroi-san or Isobe-san, would either of you be so kind as to answer the same question? Very good. So I'll take a stab at that. Climate change response. The UK and the US defense ministries are very much out front with looking at this. JMOD is a bit behind. Our defense ministry recently began work on this under the direction of the defense minister. And I am a member of one of the groups that are starting to study the question. What kind of effect will climate change have on the MOD? It's the same kind of thing that Mr. Berenson mentioned. The effect on our mission. Drought, floods, typhoons will increase, and we'll have to have more domestic disaster response activity. There are island states, including in Southeast Asia, and island nations will be at risk. The Mekong River. And there are water conflicts around the border with China. This kind of tension will only increase. Second point is the impact on equipment. High temperature, drought. How will our equipment function in a changing climate? Performance has to be maintained. And also, our militaries emit a lot of CO2, fighter jets, tanks, our fleet. So we have to look at whether we should be using more green energy. And the last area of impact is facilities. In the southwestern islands, we're at the process of building facilities. But if typhoons become more severe, our facilities have to be stronger, and our ports for the maritime self-defense and our training areas, our amphibious training areas. We have to analyze how strong they are vis-a-vis climate. So these are the three areas that we are studying right now.
はい。では、黒江さんも付け加
Very
えで。
good. So, Korea-san, you had something to add? Generally, Sobe made a very clear summary just now. Climate change is something that affects, that has cross-border effects, so it will require international cooperation. General Isobe talked about the issues that the self-defense forces will face. But depending on what kind of system of government, regardless of what kind of system of government there might be in various countries, cooperation on this question could create trust between countries. And I think it's important to include in our perspective this kind of strategic angle on this issue.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you.
少し角度の違う面白い質問が来ていますが、
I have
それ
a
は
slightly
日
different
本の
question
総合商社の
Interesting
役割についてです。
on the role of Japan's comprehensive trading companies. And Japan's trading companies so far have what will their role look like in this era where we're now importing a lot via FMS from the United States? So It's an interesting, but Mr. Croy or Isobe, would you like? This will be just a personal opinion. At the very end of my presentation, I talked about transfer of equipment and cooperation with partner countries. As to the role of Japanese trading companies, they have information functions in various companies that could be very valuable, I believe. As you know, equipment transfer is something that Japan wants to move forward with. And under the Abe government, the three principles were revised. However, in actual fact, not much real progress has been made. When you look at various individual defense industries, it's a tall order to go to a foreign government and try to see what their needs are and negotiate with them. In that context, then certainly the government should be mitigating corporate risk, and that is obviously important. But in addition, in the area of collecting information, I believe there could be, and this is a personal view, I think there could be a very big role for Japanese trading companies in that area of information collection. The roles that private enterprise can carry out, there we have another question on this. This may be another question for Kuroi-san. Private enterprise on sensitive intelligence. How can we create a credentialing system for them? The US defense industry, we could cooperate with if we had such a credentialing system for our own industry. I think that this is the so-called security clearance issue that the private sector has been raising for a long time. The government is aware of the need for this, but how are we doing this now? We have this special secrets law, and on sensitive information for specified secrets, then restrictions are placed on companies. And so, of course, any partner company would have the same restrictions placed on it. In the same way that governments work together, private companies would be allowed to be involved with sensitive information. As for a completely private sector undertaking and what kind of private sector clearance there should be, the government has not decided how much to be involved. So it's a tough question, as you know. For government's specified secrets, there are penalties for disclosing secrets, tough penalties. And so, depending on how we do this, there could be an impression given off that we were being too tough. So the government is currently studying this issue. If, for example, there were Japan-US cooperation and we needed clearances, are we going to create a security clearance system for that purpose? That's something that we are considering. Thank you for that very detailed response. Now, in the remaining questions, what shall I? Quantum technology. let's do this or that. It looks like there's a strategy on this, but military technology, defense technology was not mentioned at all. And the question is, what do you think about the fact that defense was not mentioned at all in this document on quantum technology? Isobe-san, Kure-san, you have any thoughts? Go right ahead. I think you're on mute. On quantum technology, I have nearly no knowledge. Therefore, I can't speak definitively. But I think that it could result in the development of systems such as radars and so forth. But in the strategy, there's no mention of defense. Why is that the case? Probably within it's probably because of the fact that in innovation strategies, defense is never included. This is one of the big issues that we have in Japanese society. Especially Japanese academia does not welcome our field, defense. And that is why we don't see it. We don't see defense always reflected. Innovation strategy conferences may not invite the defense minister, for example. So I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to speak to any academics that may be in attendance that when you think about defense, technology is so very important. And this it's very inefficient if you use the government's resources to develop defense technologies separately from civil technologies. So unless the way is opened up to do more of this type of activity, it will be difficult to make progress in our security. So it's a tough question. I hope I explained it well.
Isobe-sanもお願いします。
Isobe-san, go ahead. Not just quantum technology, but countries around Japan do not distinguish between civil and military activities. They have civil military fusion. So if other countries have such an approach for technology development or for military actions even, then as the Vice Minister said, we in Japan also have to cooperate. I very strongly feel that such cooperation is needed in Japan as well.
ありがとうございました。それでは最後にダグ・ベレンソンさんにお尋ねしたいと思いますが。
Lastly, this is a question for Mr. Doug Berenson. It was actually a question for Kuroe-san, but the semiconductor industry base has disappeared. How serious is this? Taiwan and Japan are cooperating, but is there a possibility of cooperation between India and Japan? This was the question. And when you look at the US, how much of a sense of crisis is there? How much importance should we give to the semiconductor industry? What kind of debate is there on this?
I think there is.
And please also add any reflections you have on our discussion overall today.
Sure. I think the question of semiconductor manufacturing capacity is I'm not sure that there is much controversy in the sense that there is a good deal of consensus here in the United States about the need to create more onshore capacity here in the United States. There is legislation pending in the Congress right now called the CHIPS Act, which would provide funding and other support to try and bring onshore more semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. And I think this will happen probably more slowly than we would like here in the United States. But I think that there is a good deal of political support for it. And it also fits in with an underlying theme that the Biden administration favors, which is more U.S. manufacturing capacity by America as a slogan and as a policy initiative is almost as powerful in the Biden administration as it was during the Trump administration. The Biden administration is a little bit more polite about it, but I think they feel the same way in terms of the need to bring onshore certain capabilities, and semiconductors is absolutely one of them. I think with regard to our proceedings today, I think we need to continue to make slow and steady progress toward the recognition of the threats that we face together, and to the changes that we can make to address those threats. Every once in a while, an issue like Ukraine happens that shocks the world into recognition and action. And as tragic as these events are, hopefully they will have the effect of moving both of our countries forward to a more robust footing. So with that, I'll pause.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Security, economics, socio-economics is a word that one of our participants coined. And the question is, how much are people in Japan thinking about it? Well, we are thinking about it. Finally, there is a realization that we must think about socio-economics. In our economic policy, I believe we will see more and more integration of security consideration. This will bring our program to a close for the moment. And what I mean by that is that we are going to be making a plea in Japanese. And so please stay. Other participants are free to leave. Now, the president of Ukraine asked for more sanctions, and only 3 hours later, we have been able to have this very timely discussion with leading figures in the defense area. Thank you so much. This will bring our program to a close. However, the discussion is not over. Please visit our website. You will be able to see questions that we were unable to answer during our program, and you will see other discussion on our website. Please be sure to check our website. Thank you very much. Here, I will be handing off the microphone.
はい、谷口先生、ありがとうございます。こんばんは。日本からご参加の皆様、ISIC ジャパン理事の鍋田と申します。来月で ISIC は設立から4年目を迎えます。コロナ禍での厳しい状況の中で走り続けてきました結果、 本日の分を含めまして、計18回に及ぶウェビナーというものを開催することができました。これはひとえに皆様方からの温かい応援があったからでありまして、関係者一同、改めてここで御礼申し上げたいと思っております。また、本日、2021年度最後のウェビナーを終えるにあたりまして、我々なりにこれまでの総括をするとともに、今後の取り組みの方向性というものを皆様方に理解していただきながら、またさらに皆様方からのご支援をお願いするためにも、あと数分程度お付き合いいただければありがたく思います。こちらに表示されております資料は後日メールでお送りいたしますので、ここでは簡単に要点を説明していきたいと思います。本日のフォーラムのテーマがそうでありましたように、ISIC のミッションというものは、日本の防衛安全保障を支える大事な産業基盤がより活性化されて、よりレジリエントに進化し続けられるよう、グローバルなマーケットでの活躍ができるような機会を見出すことを後押しするための交流の場づくりである点を改めて強調したいと思います。言い換えますと、これは ISIC ジャパンコミュニティというものを我々なりに努力しながら作っていこうということであります。直近のフォーラムにおきましては、日本の防衛を取り巻くさまざまな課題、そして日本の防衛産業が直面する厳しい現状というものが明らかになってきたわけでありますが、本日のウェビナーで強調されましたように、将来に向けた防衛産業に対する強い期待というものも示されたわけであります。また、これまでの議論を総括していきますと、さまざまな課題はあるものの、将来に向けた日本の防衛産業にとって大きな伸びしろの存在というものが見えてきたのではと思います。Could you go to the next page? Can you go to the next page? Yes. で、こちらの例えば資料に伸びしろというものはどういうものなのかということを我々に整理してみました。で、また、この伸びしろというものが実際具体化していくためには、やはり現状の日本におけます防衛エコシステムというものが、やはり不十分なところがあるのではないかというふうに考えておりますので、それをより強固なエコシステムに発展させていく上で、いく必要性というものも見出されてきたものと我々は思っております。詳細はこの資料をお送りいたしますので、ぜひご覧いただければと思います。Could you go to the next page? で、2022年度は日本の防衛、そして防衛産業にとって大変重要な年であり、このようなテーマを取り上げて、さまざまな企画というものを提供して、ISIC ジャパンコミュニティを育てていければと考えておりますが、そのためにやはり重要なことっていうのは、双方向でのコミュニケーションではないかというふうに考えております。先日のメールでもご案内しましたとおり、ウェビナーで投稿されたコメントや質問、本日もたくさんのコメントや質問が出ておりますが、ISIC として、後日フィードバックをできるように、検討していきたいと思いますし、また交流用のプラットフォームといたしまして、先ほど谷口先生の方からもお話がありましたように、ISI コネクトという新しいプラットフォームというものを作って、そういう場を通じて皆様方といろんな議論をしながら、このインターアクティブなコミュニケーションを達成できればというふうに考えております。Can you go to the next page? しかしながら、このような高い目標に向かって進んでいくためには、皆様方からの資金的な支援というものも不可欠ではあります。企業協賛、あるいは寄付、また ISI コネクトにご参加いただくことによる、いわゆるサブスクリプションを通じた資金的な支援というものがご検討いただければ、これまで以上の活動をこれからも続けていくための大事な支えとなっていきますので、何卒ご検討いただけますようお願いする次第であります。また、ご支援に関心のある方々からの要望に応じまして、現在、当会の収支報告書というものを開示できるように準備中でありますので、資料の Can you go to the next page? 最後のページにある問い合わせ先までご一報いただければと思います。 今、資料のところには入ってございませんでしたが、また連絡先を改めて後日お送りする際に、ご連絡したいと思います。以上で ISIC から皆様へのメッセージを終えさせていただきます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。引き続きまして、ちょっと英語で簡単に日本語を話せない方々向けのメッセージも続けたいと思いますので、もうしばらくお付き合いください。Okay, so good morning and good afternoon to ISIC Japan supporter joining today from all over the world. My name is Toshi Nabeta, and I am the director of ISIC Japan. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar, which was the last one for fiscal year 2021. And it's also the 18th webinar since ISIC was founded in 2019. And can you go to the next page? And no different from everyone joining tonight, ISIC has been struggling under the impact of COVID in the last 3 years, but that did not stop us from keep evolving and producing and delivering a high quality webinars like the one you just saw today. And before starting the new year for the next month, ISIC wanted to reflect on our past activities and show what we intend to focus in the coming new fiscal year, which are all described in the slide shown here. And this will be sent to everyone within the next few days. But let me just recap a few things about the key point on this. So can you go to the next page? So in this deck, you will find the key takeaways from our recent webinars, which are synthesized to show the way forward as well. So can you go to the next page? And these takeaways are synthesized the new findings, which is described in the following page. So could you go to the next page? So for example, these are the kind of growth potentials that we see for the Japan's defense market or the defense industry. So these are the area where they could grow their business and expand. And also, in order to realize these things, can you go to the next page? We also realize that Japan's defense ecosystem needs to be more strengthened, which requires more boosting and to be more, maybe the US defense ecosystem could be a model to look into, but Japan has their own unique cultural background as well that we need to take into consideration. Okay, and our mission is to strengthen Japan's defense industrial capacity through B2B collaboration in the global market. And for this very reason, we intend to be more interactive in the way we communicate with our supporters, so we could newly create an ISIC Japan community in the future together. So from our recent special announcement, you may have noticed that we prepared the ISIC's feedback to the comment and question posted during the last webinar. And we also intend to do that for this one as well. And we also plan to kick off a free trial period to experience our new communication platform, the ISI Connect, till the end of April, which will continue to offer a chance to discuss the topic of interest even after the webinar is over. And we do hope that this interactive communication will help us identify even more valuable and productive themes, which could lead to more customized group to privately share ideas in an effort to promote B2B collaboration. So you could say that many possibilities exist in the future. Can you go to the next page, please? And there is no doubt that 2022 is going to be a very special and important years for Japan's defense. And it is also going to be a critical turning point for Japan's defense industry to evolve, as it was emphasized today, which we hope to help accelerate for the sake of all the stakeholders and the supporters who's joining tonight. However, one thing we would like to draw your attention is that we also need your financial support to continue this challenge. The support could be offered in the form of a sponsorship or donation or subscribing to our ISI Connect services. Or maybe it could be also done in some other ways as we move forward. So please check out further instruction in the slides that we will be sending you soon. And thank you for spending your extra time to listen to this special message from ISIC Japan. And see you soon at our next event. And this will conclude my speech, but last but not least, ISIC board would like to appreciate the great work done by our moderator, Dr. Taniguchi. And I would like to give back the floor back to Dr. Taniguchi so he could close today's event. Thank you.
鍋田さんどうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Nabeta.
マイクロフォンを頂戴しましたが、もうこれ以上マイクロフォンを使う必要はありません。
I've been given the microphone, but I no
これ
longer
でお
need
し
to
ま
use
い
it.
です。
This
次にま
concludes
た
our program,
ありがとうございました。
and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
There is a storm brewing. Storm EW. Changing everything you know about electromagnetic warfare. Keeping you ahead of next generation threats. And scaling to meet the mission. The coverage needed to advance into the battle space. Update your fleet right now. Bring the storm.